Hey guys, tonight I want to show you a face you have already seen. If you have ever read Little House in the Big Woods, or had it read to you the way millions of children once did, then you have already met the young woman at the centre of tonight's story. You met her in the warmest, brightest scene in the whole book. The dance at Grandpa's house, deep in the Wisconsin timber, when the family gathered to make maple sugar and the night ended in music and dancing. There are aunts in that scene, young women in their best dresses, laughing, getting ready in front of a looking glass, dancing in the firelight while a small girl watches and remembers everything. One of those aunts has a name. Laura gives it to you right there on the page, Aunt Ruby. And if you read carefully, you might even remember her, faintly, a pretty young woman admiring her dress before the dance. Hold on to that picture, because it is almost the only place in the entire world where Ruby is still alive. Her full name was Ruby Celestia Ingalls. She was Charles Ingalls' little sister, the baby of the family, Pa's youngest sibling, and less than a decade after that firelit dance, she would be dead at the age of 26 in a tiny settlement on the far edge of the Nebraska frontier, leaving two small children behind. She would be lowered into a grave that, to this very day, no one has ever been able to find. And the niece who put her in that bright dancing scene, the small girl who grew up to become one of the most beloved writers in American history, would never publish a single word about what happened to her, not her marriage, not her children, not her long journey west, not her death, nothing. So tonight, I want to ask you to sit with a few questions and let them carry us all the way through the dark. Who was the baby of the Ingalls family, the one who came last and watched everyone else leave? Why did she follow a sister across half a country to a raw little town most people have never heard of? What took her life at 26 in the same season her famous relatives were fighting through the most terrible winter of their lives? Why is there no stone to mark where she lies? And the question underneath all the others, the one this whole story circles back to in the end, why did Laura, who loved her, who put her in the happiest scene she ever wrote, let her vanish so completely from the rest of it? Before we begin, I want to ask you for just one small thing, and only one. If you find a quiet kind of comfort in these forgotten stories, the true ones, the ones told slowly and told with care, then take a moment to subscribe. That is all. No long list of requests tonight. Just subscribe so that the next time one of these stories is ready, on some other long and quiet night, it can find its way back to you. Now settle in. Let the lights go low and the day fall away behind you. We are going back more than a century and a half into the deep timber and the lamplight to find the baby of the family before the world ever asked anything of her. And then we are going to follow her, gently, all the way to the end. This is the story of Ruby Ingalls, the one the books forgot. Let us begin inside that scene, because it is where almost everyone has met Ruby without ever realizing it, and because it holds, in miniature, the whole of what tonight is about. Picture the deep woods of Wisconsin in early spring. The snow is going soft and grey. The maple sap has begun to run, and at Grandpa Ingalls' house, the whole scattered family has come together for the sugaring off, the great seasonal ritual of boiling that thin, sweet sap down into sugar. It is loud and warm and crowded in a way that the long-buried months of winter never are. There is food, there is a fire, there is a fiddle, because in this family there was always a fiddle. And as the evening turns to night, the grown-ups push back the furniture, and the dancing begins. Let yourself really stand in that room for a moment, because to understand what this night meant, you have to understand the months that came before it. The Wisconsin winter did not visit gently. It came early, and it stayed long, and it buried the deep woods under snow so heavy that a family could be shut inside its own four walls for weeks at a stretch. The world narrowed down to the reach of a single fire. For people living like that, isolation was not an idea. It was the texture of half the year. You saw the same few faces. You heard the same few voices. You waited, through the long dark, for the world to open again, and then the sap began to run, and it opened. The sugaring off was the first great loosening of the year, the moment the family came pouring out of its scattered cabins and gathered itself back into one warm, loud, living thing. So when you picture that room, do not picture an ordinary party. Picture release. Picture people who have been starved of one another all winter, suddenly together, suddenly warm, the relief of it almost a physical thing in the air. Breathe in what Ruby would have breathed. The dense, dark sweetness of the sap boiling down, a smell so thick you could almost taste the sugar in it. Wood smoke, tallow candles and a banked roaring fire, the damp wool of coats drying near the hearth, the smell of bodies and food, and a house packed far past its comfortable number. Hear what she would have heard. The fiddle rising over everything, and under it the stamp and shuffle of feet on a plank floor, and laughter, and the high bright noise of children let loose and running underfoot. And the older voices of the grandparents, watching from the edges, remembering their own young dancing years. And feel what it was to be young in that room, on that night, with the snow finally softening outside, and the whole brief season of your youth burning as bright as the fire. The young women like Ruby were at the very centre of it, in the dresses they had been saving, and for a few hours the hard arithmetic of frontier life was suspended. And there was only the music and the warmth and the dance. This was not a small thing in their lives. This was one of the bright pages, the kind of night a person carries with them for the rest of their years, the kind a child watching from the corner files away so deeply that she can call it back, whole, half a century later, and write it down. That is the night Laura kept. That is the Ruby she chose to preserve. And now you can see her in it properly, not as a name on a page, but as a living young woman in a warm room on the best night of the long year, with the firelight on her face. Now narrow your eye to the young women in the room. Now narrow your eye to the young women in the room. The aunts. They are in that brief, golden window of a frontier woman's life. Old enough to be lovely, and young enough to be free, before marriage and children, and the relentless arithmetic of survival close over them. They are wearing their very best dresses, the ones saved for exactly a night like this. And one of them, by the looking-glass, smoothing her skirt, catching her own reflection in the candle light, is a girl named Ruby. To the small child watching from the edge of the room, she is simply one of the pretty ones. A flash of colour and motion and laughter. The child does not know, could not know, that she is looking at a young woman with almost her entire life still ahead of her, and almost no time at all to live it. The child only knows that the night is warm and the music is bright, and her aunts are beautiful. That small child was Laura, and here is the quiet engine of this whole story, the thing I want you to carry with you as we go. Decades later, an old woman would sit down to turn that exact evening into one of the most beloved chapters in American children's literature, and she would reach back across all those years and place Ruby right there in the firelight, named, dancing, alive. She would give the world that one bright glimpse of her aunt, and then she would give the world nothing else. Not one word more. Think about how strange that is, once you really look at it. Laura did not forget Ruby. She remembered her vividly enough to put her in a book, by name, in the happiest scene she ever wrote. The memory was not lost, it was kept. It was chosen, which means that the silence about everything that came afterward, the marriage and the children, and the journey and the death, was also chosen. Somewhere between that dancing girl and the woman in the unmarked grave, a door quietly closed, and Laura was the one who closed it. We are going to spend tonight on the other side of that door. Before we walk back to the beginning, I want to tell you about a photograph, because against the long odds of that century, one survives. At some point, on a day no record dates for us, a camera was set up in front of a gathering of the Ingalls family, the older generation, the household Ruby was born into, In the front row sits her father, Lansford, and her mother, Laura Colby Ingalls, with two of their daughters beside them, Lydia and Ruby. Standing behind them are three of the brothers, James and George and Hiram. A row of the family that the road had not yet scattered too far to gather. Ruby is not dancing in it. No one dances in photographs from that century. The exposures were long and the occasion was solemn, and so she sits still, facing forward, holding herself motionless for the camera's slow eye. A young woman fixed in silver and shadow, and that stillness is very nearly all the face the record ever kept of her. One book scene where she moves and laughs in the firelight, one photograph where she sits frozen and silent beside her mother and father. Between those two images, the dancing girl and the still one, runs the entire short road we are about to walk tonight. Hold both of them, because by the end of this night, you are going to understand exactly how a young woman could be caught twice, once on a page and once on a photographic plate, and still manage to vanish so completely that the world cannot even find her grave. But first, we have to back up, because the dancing aunt did not arrive in that scene out of nowhere. She had a childhood, and it was a strange and lonely sort of childhood, in its own quiet way, shaped by a single fact that almost no one ever thinks about when they think of the Ingalls family. Ruby was the last one, the baby, the youngest of them all, and, being the youngest of a large frontier family that was always moving, meant something very particular. It meant she would spend her whole girlhood watching the people she loved walk out the door, one by one, and not come back. Let us go meet her there, at the very beginning, in the crowded house before it began to empty. Ruby Celestia Ingalls was born on the 23rd of May, in 1855, in Concord, Wisconsin. By the time she arrived, the Ingalls household was already a long story in progress. Her father, Lansford Whiting Ingalls, and her mother, Laura Louise Colby Ingalls, had been having children for more than 20 years. The eldest, Peter, had been born back in 1833. A full generation earlier, her brother Charles, the one who would become Pa, the one whose family would one day be famous, had come along in 1836, 19 years before Ruby drew her first breath. By the time Ruby was old enough to know her own family, some of her brothers and sisters were already adults with lives of their own beginning to pull them away. Try to feel what that meant, to be the last child in a family like that. Ruby was not raised in the same household her older siblings had been raised in. Not really. The big, loud, overflowing house her brother Charles had grown up in, packed wall to wall with children, was already thinning out by the time Ruby was small. She was the baby in a home that had passed its peak, the youngest face at a table that was slowly losing its older ones. While Charles had grown up surrounded by a crowd, Ruby grew up watching that crowd leave. And leave they did, because this was the great age of the Western migration, and the Ingalls family was caught up in it like a leaf in a current. One by one, the older brothers and sisters grew up, married, and went looking for land of their own, which always seemed to lie a little further west than where they stood. To understand the pull that kept taking them, you have to understand the promise that drove the whole century. Out west, beyond the settled country, was land. Cheap land, and then, in time, very nearly free land. More of it than a family in the worn and crowded East could ever dream of owning, for people who measured a man's worth in acres, who had watched their own parents scrape at thin and stony soil. The open country to the west was not just real estate. It was hope itself, the chance to finally own enough, to finally get ahead, to finally stop renting your life from someone else. And so, the young people went, generation after generation, drawn over the horizon by that promise, leaving the old folks and the old places behind them. The Ingalls family was woven straight into that current. They were old stock New England people, the descendants of farmers who had been drifting steadily westward for generations, out of the east, across New York, into the Great Lakes country, always chasing that same horizon. Ruby was born into the tail end of that long migration into a family that already had restlessness in its blood. And so the leaving, when it came for her brothers and sisters, was not a series of strange or sad departures. It was simply what the family did. It was the water they swam in, but knowing that it was normal does not make it gentle. And here is where you have to hold Ruby's particular place in it. Her brother Charles, the one who would become Pa, was 19 years older than she was. By the time Ruby was a small girl, just beginning to know the world, Charles was already a grown man stepping into his own restless life. He married Caroline Quiner. He began the long wandering that would carry him out of Wisconsin entirely, down into Kansas, into Minnesota, and eventually all the way to Dakota, to his own children, the ones he carried along with him. That journey was the great adventure of their lives. But to his baby sister Ruby, left behind in the older country, Charles was something else. He was a brother who was mostly somewhere else, a figure who came and went, a man building a famous future hundreds of miles away, while she grew up in the house he had already left. And Charles was only one of them. There were others, the older sisters and brothers, each in turn reaching the age when a young person looked at the horizon and decided to chase it. Each wedding was a doorway, and each doorway led away. The household that had once been crowded to bursting grew quieter, year by year, as the older faces left it. And Ruby, the last child, was always the one who stayed longest, the one still at home when the others had gone, the one who learned, before she was old enough to put words to it, that this was simply how her family worked. You loved people, and then they went west. There is a particular loneliness in being the youngest of a scattering family, and it is not the loud kind. It is quiet. It is the empty chair. The bed no longer has a sister in it. The gradual hush of a house that used to be loud. We have no record of Ruby naming that loneliness, and I will not put words in her mouth that she never spoke, but the shape of it is unmistakable in the simple facts of her life. And it makes what she did at the very end, when her own turn to travel finally came, all the more moving. Because when Ruby finally packed her own wagon and went west, she would not be going to escape her family, or to chase an empty horizon. She would be going to find one of them. She would spend the goodbyes of her childhood, in the end, buying herself one last hello. And in the meantime, she was the one who stayed. That is the other half of being the youngest in a scattering family. The half that gets no attention, because it makes no story. Somebody is always the last one home. As the older ones married out and moved away, one by one, the daily life of the home place settled more and more onto the children who remained. And at the bottom of that dwindling list, always, was Ruby. She grew up not only watching her family leave, but absorbing the work they left behind, the endless round of a frontier household now running on fewer and fewer hands. And she grew up close to her parents. In the particular way, the youngest child is close, the one still at the table, after the others have tables of their own. The one who knows her mother and father, not in their vigorous prime, the way the older children had, but in their greying years, slowing, softening, beginning to lean on the children instead of carrying them. There is no diary to tell us what Ruby and her aging parents were to each other. And I will not invent their conversations, but the shape of it sits in the simple arithmetic of the household. By the time Ruby was a young woman, her parents had been raising children for some 40 years, and she was the last of that long labour, the final daughter in the house, and in a world without pensions and without rest, the unspoken question that hung over every youngest daughter hung over her too. When her own turn came to walk out the door, who would be left standing in it? It is one of the oldest, quietest dilemmas there is, and the frontier sharpened it to a point. The same family bonds that asked a young woman to stay close were the very bonds that would, in the end, pull her west. Hold that tension as we go, because it is the engine of everything Ruby does in the second half of this story. Love kept her, and love moved her, and the two were never separate things, not even for a day. But that is years away yet. First, the youngest daughter of the Ingalls family was going to get her own turn at the doorway every one of her siblings had walked through before her. Some went to new farms in Wisconsin, some went further. Charles himself married a young woman named Caroline Quiner and began the restless wandering that would carry his own little family across half the continent, into Kansas, into Minnesota, eventually into Dakota Territory. To Ruby, her famous brother Charles may have been less a constant presence than a figure who appeared and disappeared, a grown man with a wife, and then with babies of his own, glimpsed at gatherings, and then gone again over the horizon. This is something the Little House books can never quite show you, because they are told from the point of view of Charles's own children looking outward, but shift the angle. That's where Ruby stood in the old family home, and the same frontier that looks like adventure from one direction likes a slow, steady emptying from the other. Every wedding was a celebration and a loss at the same time. Every wagon that pulled away with a brother or a sister aboard made the house a little quieter. The youngest child of a migrating family learns young that love and goodbye are almost the same word, that the people you adore are always, eventually, going to pack a wagon and vanish into the west, and that you will be the one left standing in the dooryard, waving, growing up in the space they leave behind. We do not have a diary from Ruby. We do not have her letters. The record of her early life is thin, just the bones of it, a birth, a place, a family. And I am not going to invent the rest, because the honest thing, when the record falls silent, is to say so plainly, and to stand at the edge of that silence, rather than fill it with things that were never written down. But the shape of her childhood we can know, because it was the shape of 1,000 such childhoods, and because the simple facts of when she was born and where she fell in the family Lily tell us a great deal on their own. She came of age in the 1860s and into the 1870s in a Wisconsin that was steadily filling in, becoming less frontier and more settled, even as the true frontier rolled further west and took her brothers and sisters with it. And somewhere in those years came the night we have already seen, the sugaring off at Grandpa's, the dance, Ruby in her best dress by the looking-glass, one of the pretty young aunts, with a small niece named Laura watching from the edge of the room. But before we leave that night behind, stand somewhere new inside it, just for a moment. In the first chapter we watched it through the eyes of the little girl at the edge of the room, because that is the view the book gives us, the only view the world has ever had. Now cross the room. Stand where Ruby stood, a girl of about 17, in the best dress she owned, on the one bright crowded night of the whole long year, and look back at it all from inside. What did she see? Not a famous scene in a beloved book. None of that existed yet, and none of it would ever exist for her. She saw her family whole in one room in a way it had not been whole in years, and would never quite be whole again. The older brothers and sisters home from their scattered farms, little nieces and nephews underfoot, children of the very weddings that had been emptying her childhood house. Her parents by the fire, watching their children's children. The whole spread-out map of her family folded, for one night, back into a single warm room, and ahead of her, from where she stood, nothing but future. The man she would someday marry, the home she would keep, the children she would raise. All of it unwritten, all of it possible, all of it shining somewhere just past the music. That is what a dance is when you are 17. It is the place where the future feels close enough to touch. She could not see the shape of hers. No one ever can, and it is precisely because she could not see it that the scene is bearable at all, and precisely because we can, that it aches. 2 people stood in that room that night, with claims on the future. The little girl watching would get another 85 years and a shelf of immortal books. The young woman dancing would get 1 decade. Neither of them knew. The fiddle played for both of them just the same. Now here is something worth pausing on, because it ties the whole family together in a way the books never spell out. Ruby was not the only sister in that dancing scene. Among the aunts that night was another of Charles's sisters, a young woman named Docia, and the two of them, Ruby and Docia, the bright young aunts of the big woods, would turn out to be bound together far more tightly than anyone in that warm room could have guessed. Because years later, when Ruby's own life reached its final turn, it would be Docia she went looking for. It would be Docia she followed to the very edge of the map. The two sisters who danced together in the firelight would end up together again, far away at the end. But that is getting ahead of ourselves, and the getting there is the whole story. Because before Ruby went anywhere, before the journey and the ending, she did the thing that young women in her world were expected to do, the thing that opened the next chapter of her life. She fell in love, she married, and for one brief, bright stretch of years, it looked as though the baby of the family was going to get the ordinary happy life that the frontier so rarely handed out. Let us go to the wedding. In March of 1877, Ruby Ingalls married a man named Joseph Card. She was 21 years old. He was a few years older, born around 1849, which made him a man in the full strength of his youth, old enough to have found his feet in the world, and young enough to be building toward a future. We do not have the love story. We do not have the courtship, the first meeting, the moment she decided he was the one. The record gives us the fact, and not the feeling, but we can place that fact inside the world it happened in. And the world tells us what such a marriage meant. A courtship on the frontier was a quieter, slower, more watched affair than anything we would recognise now. There was no privacy to speak of, not really. A young man came calling, and the whole family knew it, and the whole small community knew it soon after. Couples got to know each other at the gatherings that frontier life, the dances and the church socials and the work parties, the same kind of evening as that sugaring off where we first found Ruby. The decision to marry was rarely a single dramatic moment. It was a slow accumulation of certainty. Two young people deciding, in the steady unspoken way of that world, that they would face the long and dangerous work of frontier life together rather than alone. Picture the wedding itself, because the calendar is quietly doing something beautiful here. March, in the Wisconsin country, is the sugaring season. It is the very season of the night this whole story began with. The season when the sap rises, and the long winter cracks open and scattered families come together in the warmth after the cold. We do not know the day they chose or why they chose it, and I will not pretend the symbolism was in anyone's mind. But the fact sits in the record all the same. The girl from the sugaring off dance was married in sugaring season, at the exact turning of the year, when her world had always been at its brightest. A frontier wedding was nothing like the productions we stage now. There was no industry around it, no year of planning, no costume worn once and kept forever. A young couple stood up in a parlour or a small church before a minister or a justice, in the best clothes they already owned, with whatever family could gather standing near. There were plain vows, plainly said. There was a supper afterward if the family could manage one. The good food brought out, the neighbours in, perhaps a fiddle if anyone could play, and the old people watching the young ones, the way old people always watch a wedding, half in joy and half in memory. And then, often the very next morning, the married life simply began. No honeymoon, no wedding journey. The frontier did not pause for sentiment. There were animals to feed, and fires to keep, and a household to set running, and the deepest truth of a frontier wedding was that it was less a celebration than a beginning of work. Two people yoking themselves together for the long pull ahead. Somewhere inside that plain march ceremony, Ruby Ingalls became Ruby Card, and the first married years kept her close, a new wife still inside, the familiar country of her girlhood. the vanishing over the horizon would come later. And it would come when it came, by her own choice, for her own reasons, with her own 2 children in her arms. And it was work, and it was dangerous, and they both knew it going in. To marry on the frontier was to sign on for a partnership of labour as much as a partnership of love. A husband and a wife were a single economic unit, each carrying half of an enormous burden that neither could carry alone. He would break and work the land, tend the animals, do the heavy building and hauling. She would run the entire interior world of the household, which on the frontier was a staggering amount of work that we can barely imagine now. Cooking every meal from raw ingredients over an open fire, baking the bread, preserving the food that had to last the winter, hauling the water, making the soap and the candles, spinning and sewing and endlessly mending, tending the garden, the chickens, the sick, and on top of all of it, bearing and raising the children who came early and often, because that was simply how it was. That is the life Ruby was stepping into when she married Joseph Card. Not a fairy tale, a partnership, and a hard one in a hard world, but also, and this matters, a life she had chosen, with a man she had chosen. For a young frontier woman, marriage was the great threshold, the door between the family you were born into and the family you would make. And for Ruby in particular, it must have carried a special weight, because Ruby had spent her whole life watching her brothers and sisters walk through that exact door and disappear into lives of their own. Now at last it was her turn. The baby of the family, the one who had always been left behind, was finally going to do the leaving. She was going to build a household of her own, a home with her own name on it, a future that belonged to her. And the future came quickly, the way it did on the frontier. In December of that same year, 1877, just 9 months after the wedding, Ruby gave birth to her first child. A son. They named him Sherman. Sherman George Card, born in the depths of a Wisconsin December, the first cradle in Ruby's own home. Picture that first winter as a mother. A young woman, barely past 21, in her own house at last, with a husband and a newborn son, and the whole long road of a life seemingly stretched out ahead of her. The frontier was hard, always, and no one knew that better than a daughter of the Ingalls family. But, in that moment, in that first cradle, and that first winter, Ruby had everything a young woman of her world was supposed to want. She had crossed the threshold. She had made it through to the other side, to a home and a family of her own. And do not let that gentle picture hide what it had cost to reach it, because every frontier cradle was filled, at a price of risk we can barely imagine now. A woman giving birth in that world did so without a hospital, usually without a doctor, often with only other women to help her, a mother or a sister or a neighbour who had done it themselves. There was no real defence against the things that could go wrong. Infection, hemorrhage. A difficult birth with no surgeon within a day's reach. Childbirth was one of the most common ways for a young woman to die, and every woman who walked into it knew that, carried the knowledge quietly, made her peace with it as best she could. Because there was no other way to have the family her whole life was built around. Hold that shadow gently as we go, not because we know it is what took Ruby in the end, for we do not, but because it hung over every year of a young mother's life on that frontier, hers included. Every cradle a frontier woman filled was, in its own quiet way, an act of courage. Ruby had just filled her first, and there would be a second child too, a daughter named Alma. The records of exactly when Alma arrived are not as clear as we would like, and I will not pretend to a precision the sources do not give me, but we know that Ruby, in these years, became the mother of 2, a boy and a girl, Sherman and Alma. 2 small lives that depended on her completely, 2 new threads woven into the great tangled fabric of the Ingalls and Card families. And around those 2 cradles gathered the ordinary years, roughly 4 of them, between the wedding and the journey that ends this story. The records, in their spare way, let us glimpse the young family moving through them. They were Wisconsin people at first, as Ruby had always been. And then, somewhere in those years, the record places the cards in Minnesota as well, the young household doing, in its own modest way, exactly what every branch of this family had always done, edging westward, a state at a time, testing the newer country the way her people had been testing it for 100 years. And through those same years, along the slow channels that held a scattered family together, the letters, the travellers, the word passed from hand to hand at gatherings, the news of the wider Ingalls world would have kept finding her. Word of her brother, Charles, fighting the grasshopper plagues on his Minnesota farm, watching clouds of insects eat his crops down to the dirt, season after season. Word of the terrible illness that took her niece Mary's sight, a blow that reshaped that whole famous household in a single season. And then word of the boldest move of all, the one you may already know from another night. The whole of Charles's household, pulling up stakes for Dakota Territory, bound for a railroad camp and a job that had come to him through his sister Docia. And word of Docia herself, settling with her own family in the raw new country, putting down roots at the far edge of everything. If Ruby traced all of it from her own kitchen, as she must have, then what she watched, letter by letter and year by year, was the map of her family redrawing itself westward, name after name sliding off the old settled page and onto the new empty one. The pull of the West working through her people the way it always had, one household at a time, until at last the pull of it reached her own door. So here is Ruby at the high point of her story, and I want you to hold this image clearly, because it is the last bright one we are going to get. A young wife in her mid-20s, a husband, a little boy, a baby girl, a home. The baby of the family had grown all the way up, and against the long odds of frontier life, she had built something whole and good and her own. But you already know, because I told you at the very beginning, that this is not where the story ends. You know that within just a few years of this bright moment, Ruby will be gone, dead at 26, far from this Wisconsin home, in a place she has not yet seen. And so the question that pulls us forward now is the obvious one, the one you have been holding since the start. How? How does a young mother with a husband and 2 children and a home of her own end up dying at 26 on the far edge of the Nebraska frontier? The answer begins with a decision. The Card family was going to pull up stakes once more. They were going to do the thing the whole Ingalls clan had been doing for 2 generations. They were going to go west, but Ruby was not going west the way her brothers had gone, blindly, toward an empty horizon and a stranger's promise of land. Ruby was going west towards something specific. Toward someone. She was going to follow her sister. To understand why Ruby went all the way to the Nebraska frontier, you have to remember the sister from the dancing scene. Docia. By the end of the 1870s, Docia, Ruby's older sister, the other bright young aunt from the firelight at Grandpa's, had lived a hard and complicated life of her own, and had come out the far side of it remarried to a man whose work carried the family ever westward. Her husband was tied to the great enterprise of the age, the railroads and the settlement of the open plains, the vast machine that was cracking the western grasslands open for farms and towns, and that work did not stay in one place. It moved, it followed the rails and the new land, and it had already carried Docia's family through Dakota Territory in the years just past. By the opening of the 1880s, it had drawn them onward again, out past the settled country, to the unbroken ground at the front of it all. They had come to a place in northern Nebraska, Holt County, a small settlement called Inman, out on the Nebraska frontier, the kind of place that had barely existed a few years before and was now filling, slowly, with families chasing the same dream that had pulled Americans west for generations. Let me set you down in that world for a moment, because the Nebraska that Ruby travelled toward was one of the rawest, newest places in the entire country, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything that happened next. Northern Nebraska, at the start of the 1880s, was the very leading edge of American settlement. Just a short time before, this had been open grassland, the domain of vast skies and tall grass, and the native nations who had lived there for generations. And then, in a rush, it was opening. The railroads were pushing across it, and behind the railroads came the great land rush, drawn by the promise of homesteads, the chance to claim a piece of the public land and, by living on it and working it, to make it your own. Families poured in from the east and from the older settled states, and towns appeared almost out of nothing, a depot and a store and a scatter of houses where a season before there had been only grass. These places were new in a way that is hard for us to feel now. There was no deep root anywhere. The trees were young or absent. The buildings were raw lumber, hastily thrown up. The cemeteries, where they existed at all, were nearly empty, just a few fresh graves in a corner of the prairie, because the towns themselves were too young to have buried many of their own yet. Everything was beginning. Everything was thin. A family on that frontier was profoundly alone, a single household against an enormous and indifferent landscape, far from the kind of help and comfort and safety that older, settled places could offer. And the dangers of such a place were real and constant. The medical help was distant, often a hard journey of many hours over rough country, if it existed at all. Disease moved through these isolated settlements with frightening ease, and when it came, there was often little anyone could do but nurse the sick and hope. The winters were savage, sweeping down out of the north across country with nothing to break the wind. And the ordinary perils of frontier life, the accidents, the childbirths, the fevers, all of them were made worse by the sheer isolation, the distance from anyone who could help. And for the women of that frontier, there was a further dimension to the hardness. One, the histories took a long time to write down honestly. The men who came to the plains came to land, to work they could see and measure, to fields and stock, and the company of other men at the depot and the lumber yard. The women came to houses, small ones, standing alone in an immensity of grass, under a sky that did not stop, and a wind that did not stop, and the letters and memoirs of plains women returned to that wind, again and again, the endless day and night pressing of it against the walls, until some of them wrote that it was the wind, more than the cold or the work or the fear, that wore a person thin. A plains wife could pass whole days with no adult voice in the house but her own. Her mother was hundreds of miles behind her. Her sisters were scattered down other roads. The church circle, the quilting afternoon, the easy traffic of women in and out of one another's kitchens that had cushioned female life in the settled country, all of it had to be built again from nothing, and in a settlement as young as Inman, very little of it had been built yet. Hold that in your mind, and then look once more at what Ruby was actually doing, because it changes the meaning of her journey entirely. She was not only moving toward a sister, she was moving toward the one thing the plains could not otherwise give her, another woman of her own blood, within reach, on the same horizon, someone to stand with her when the children were sick, someone whose kitchen she could walk to, someone whose voice could fill the silence the wind left behind. For a man on that frontier, a brother nearby was a help. For a woman, a sister nearby was something much closer to a lifeline. Understand that, and you understand that Ruby's journey was not reckless, and it was not sentimental. It was, by the deepest logic of a frontier woman's life, profoundly practical. She was carrying her family to the one place on the whole open map where she would not be alone. This is the world Ruby chose to bring her two small children into. And I want to be clear about why she chose it, because it would be easy to misunderstand. She did not go to Nebraska because it was safe or comfortable or wise. She went because Docia was there. The whole journey, hundreds of miles with a toddler and a baby, away from the security of the settled country and out to the raw edge of settlement, was as an act of love. A daughter of a scattering family deciding that being near her sister was worth more than the safety she was leaving behind. Picture the journey itself, because every mile of it cost her something. A young mother, her husband, a small boy of 3, a baby girl, their whole life packed down into whatever they could carry. By 1881, a journey like theirs was a different thing it had been for the wagon generations before them. And in some ways a stranger one. The rails had reached deep into the west by then, and a family with the fare could ride a long part of the distance behind a locomotive, sitting upright on hard coach seats through the days and the nights, watching from the window as the country performed its great slow transformation, the deep woods of her childhood giving way to farmland, the farmland thinning to open prairie, the prairie stretching mile after mile after mile into grass without end, under a sky that grew until it seemed to take up the whole world. A woman who had spent her entire life among trees would have watched the last of them fall away behind her, and felt, it's in some quiet part of herself, that she was sailing off the edge of everything she knew. And the rails only carried you so far. The last leg of a journey to a place like Inman was still the old kind. A wagon, a team, a rutted track running out across open country, the children bundled against the wind. Travel like that, with a 3-year-old and a baby, was its own slow ordeal. The feeding and the soothing and the endless watching, the nights in strange rooms or under the wagon, the constant low fear of a child taking sick 100 miles from anywhere. Every mother who made that crossing carried her children through it 1 hour at a time. And then came the arrival, which on the plains had its own particular strangeness, because there was so little to arrive at. No city gates, no church spire rising over a valley, just the moment when a scatter of raw buildings detached itself from the horizon and grew slowly larger, and someone said, "That is it, that is the place," and the whole of your new life stood there on the grass, small enough to take in with a single look. And waiting there, somewhere in that raw new country, was Docia, the sister from the firelight, the two of them who had danced together as girls in their father's warm house. United now at the very end of the settled world, ready to raise their children side by side. For a moment, hold that reunion in your mind as the gift it was, before the rest of the story takes it away. Whatever the frontier was about to do, in this one moment it had done something kind. It had brought 2 sisters back together. That was 1881. And mark the shape of what Ruby had just done, because it is the most quietly beautiful fact of her whole short life. The girl who had spent her childhood standing in the dooryard, watching the people she loved disappear west one by one, had finally loaded her own life into motion. And she had pointed it not at empty land, not at a stranger's promise of better soil, but at her sister. Every goodbye of her girlhood had been leading, it turned out. To this one, hello. 2 aunts from a firelit Wisconsin dance were neighbours, again, out where the maps ran thin. If you have followed these stories before, you may already know Docia's name, and the hard, dramatic road that brought her to that frontier. The road we walked together on another night. Ruby's road has now joined it. But I have to be honest with you about what waited underneath that reunion, because you already know how this chapter ends. The same raw, new, half-built world that let 2 sisters find each other again, kept no mercy in, reserve. You have heard what that country was. Hold all of it in your mind now, as Ruby unpacks her household at the end of the long road, because the clock that began ticking the day she arrived had less than a year left on it. She had come, then, in the same year, by one of the strangest quiet coincidences in this family's history, that her famous brother's household, far to the north in Dakota Territory, was emerging from the most legendary ordeal of their entire lives. And while we tend to remember that one famous winter, the one that became a famous book. Almost no one remembers what that same year was quietly doing, much further down the line, to the baby of the family who had come all that way just to be near her sister. To the winter of 1881, and I have to tell you before we go that this is the hardest part of the story, and the part where the record grows quietest and where I am going to have to be the most careful, because what we know for certain is very little, and what we do not know we will not invent. 1881. Hold the whole family in your mind for a moment, scattered across the map, because the timing of it is something almost no one has ever put together, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Far to the north, in the brand new town of De Smet in Dakota Territory, Charles Ingalls and his wife and his daughters, the family the whole world would come to know, had just lived through the winter that would become one of the most famous in American memory. It is worth walking through that winter for a moment, not to retell it in full, but so that you can feel the strange and terrible parallel that almost no one has ever noticed. Because the winter of 1880 and 1881 was not an ordinary hard season. It was one of the most brutal winters the northern plains have ever recorded. In the little town of De Smet, where Charles and his family lived, the blizzards began in October, before anyone was ready, and then simply did not stop. Storm after storm came howling down out of the northwest, one every few days, for month after month, from autumn nearly to spring. The snow piled up until it buried the town nearly to the rooftops. The trains, the lifeline that brought in food and fuel, were blocked by drifts the crews could not clear, and they stopped coming, and the town was cut off from the world. And so Charles and his wife and his daughters spent that winter in a slow fight against cold and hunger, and darkness, twisting hay into sticks to burn when the coal ran out, grinding seed wheat in a coffee mill to make bread when the food ran low, listening to the wind scream against the walls, and not knowing when or whether it would end. They survived, all of them, and because they survived, and because one of those daughters grew up to be a writer, that winter became immortal, one of the most powerful and beloved survival stories in American letters. Now hold that picture, and set another one beside it, the one no one ever paints. Because somewhere along the family's long westering line, through that very same stretch of months, a young mother named Ruby was bound for Nebraska. The records do not tell us exactly when in 1881 the Cards made their move to Inman, and I will not pretend they do. What they tell us is the shape of the coincidence, and it is strange enough on its own. The year the famous branch of this family survived the worst winter of their lives was the very year its youngest daughter arrived at the place where her own life would end. While the trains were digging out and the relief was rolling north, and her brother's town was coming slowly back from the brink, Ruby was rolling west, toward her sister, toward the new beginning, toward the last address she would ever have. And here is the thing about the dangers that surrounded a woman like Ruby. They did not announce themselves, and they did not wait for a dramatic moment. The frontier killed quietly, and constantly, and often without warning. It took the strong along with the weak. It took people in the space of a few days, from things a doctor and a hospital could shrug off today, and in a thin new settlement far from either, there was often no real defence at all. Only nursing, and waiting, and prayer. That was the world Ruby was living in as 1881 wore on. A young mother at the very edge of human settlement, in the aftermath of one of the harshest seasons that country had ever recorded, surrounded by dangers that took the young and the strong all the time, with very little standing between her family and disaster. And before we go down into the last of it, mark one more figure in this scattered family portrait, because she is going to matter enormously at the very end of tonight. Up in De Smet, among the daughters who came through that famous winter, was a girl named Laura. She turned 14 that year, old enough to understand everything that happened around her. old enough to remember all of it. Hold on to her, and hold on to her age, because the final chapter of this story belongs to her and to a choice she would make half a century later. For now, though, stay down in Nebraska, because there, in the little settlement of Inman, Charles's youngest sister was living the last months of her life. We know almost nothing about how those final months passed for Ruby. We know she was there, near her sister at last, making the new beginning she had crossed half a country to make. And we know how the year ended, because that single fact, unlike so much else, was written down. On the first day of December, in 1881, Ruby Celestia Ingalls died. She was 26 years old. I want to stop here and be completely honest with you, because you deserve that, and because this is exactly the kind of moment where a lesser telling would reach for drama it has not earned. We do not know what killed her. The record that survives gives us the date and the place and the age, and it does not give us the cause. It may have been disease, the kind that swept so easily through these isolated frontier settlements. It may have been connected to childbirth, the great and constant danger to young women in her years, in a place with no real doctor near. It may have been something else entirely. I do not know, and the sources I can stand behind do not know, and so I am not going to tell you a story about her final hours that no one ever recorded. I am going to leave that silence exactly as it is, because the silence is part of the truth, and because Ruby deserves honesty more than she deserves a good ending invented to satisfy us. But let yourself feel, even without the details, the simple human weight of what happened. A young woman, 26 years old, who had grown up the baby of a big family, who had built a home and a marriage, who had borne 2 children, who had travelled across half a country to be near the sister she loved, was gone. In a single year, the bright dancing aunt of the Wisconsin firelight became a memory. She left behind a husband. She left behind a little boy named Sherman, not yet 4 years old, and a baby daughter named Alma, who would grow up with no memory of her mother's face at all. And consider, just for a moment, the cruel symmetry of that year for this one family. In 1881, the Ingalls family both survived and did not. To the north, Charles and his daughters came through their terrible winter alive, and their survival became a story the whole world would cherish. To the south, Charles's youngest sister did not come through her year at all, and her death became a story no one would tell. The same family, the same year, one ending written into the heart of American memory, the other lowered quietly into the Nebraska ground, and very nearly lost forever. What became of the husband and the 2 small children she left behind? Where their long roads led after hers ended so short we will come to before this night is over, because their story is the last living piece of hers. But Ruby herself stopped there. At 26, on the 1st of December, 1881, on the Nebraska plain. And then comes the detail that for me is the most haunting one in this entire story. Because when a person dies, we mark the place. It is one of the oldest and most human things we do. We lay them in the ground and we set a stone so that someone, someday, can stand at that spot and know that here is where they rest. It is how we promise the dead that they will not be entirely forgotten. Ruby got no such promise, or, if she did, it did not last, because the grave of Ruby Ingalls cannot be found. She is believed to be buried in the cemetery at Inman, in Holt County, Nebraska, near where she died and near where her sister lived. That much the record suggests, but no headstone marking her grave has ever been found. No stone, no name carved into anything that has survived. Somewhere in or near that small Nebraska cemetery, the baby of the Ingalls family lies in the ground, and not one person alive today can point to the exact spot and say, with certainty, she is here. I want you to understand that this was not unusual on the frontier, and understanding why is its own quiet heartbreak. Headstones cost money, real money, the kind a young family scraping a living out of raw prairie often simply did not have. A proper carved stone had to be bought and shipped and hauled, and in a brand new settlement hundreds of miles from anywhere, that was a luxury beyond the reach of most. So the frontier was dotted everywhere with graves marked only by wood, a simple board, a rough cross, a plank with a name scratched into it by a grieving hand. And wood does not last. It rots, it weathers, it falls. Within a generation, sometimes within a few short years, the marker was gone, and the grave it stood over became just another patch of prairie grass, indistinguishable from all the rest. That's almost certainly what happened to Ruby. A young woman, far from the family burial grounds of her childhood, dying in a settlement too new and too poor to give her a stone that would last. A wooden marker, perhaps, set by her husband or her sister, with her name on it for a little while, and then the years, and the weather, and the slow erasing patience of the open plains, until even that was gone, and Ruby's resting place dissolved back into the anonymous earth. No account survives of the day they buried her, and I will not invent one, but the shape of such a day is known, because it was the shape of 1,000 days, like it all across that frontier, and we can stand quietly at the edge of it without pretending to see more than we do. It was December on the northern Nebraska plains. The deep cold would have been down already, the ground hardening toward iron, the grass gone brittle and pale, the wind running unbroken across country with nothing to slow it. A frontier funeral in a settlement like Inman was a plain affair. There was no undertaker's parlour, no procession of carriages. There were neighbours' hands, and a coffin of sawnboards, and a wagon moving slowly out from the houses to the burying ground, and a small knot of dark figures standing together on the open grass, while plain words were said into the wind, a prayer, a psalm perhaps, the first frozen clods going down, and then the walk back, which anyone who has ever buried someone knows is the longest walk there is. Who stood at that graveside? No record says. Her husband, surely. The 2 children, surely. Too small between them to understand what the box meant. And it is hard to imagine otherwise her sister. Docia. Stand with Docia there for a moment, because the cruelty of her position has a precision to it that is hard to look at directly. She was the whole reason Ruby had come. The reunion of the 2 dancing aunts was the bright ending Ruby's long road was supposed to have, and within the year, Docia was standing over that road's true ending, watching her baby sister go into the winter ground of the very place she had drawn her toward. No one was to blame for that. Nothing about it was anyone's doing, but grief does not check the ledger before it lands, and it is hard to imagine she never once felt the terrible arithmetic of it in the years that followed. Ruby had come for a hello. It had ended like this. And then the living did what the living on that frontier always did. Because there was no other choice. They went on. Earlier tonight I promised you we would follow the ones she left behind. And this is the place to keep that promise, because what became of them is the last living chapter of Ruby's story. Her husband, Joseph Card, lived on. And on. He carried his life forward out of that December for more than 40 years. Through the turn of the century, through the Great War, all the way into the 1920s, a span so long that the world he finally died in would have been unrecognizable to the young woman he buried on the Nebraska grass. Automobiles, telephones, moving pictures. He crossed the whole distance from her world into something close to ours, and she stayed behind in 1881, 26 forever. The children grew. Sherman, the little boy, turned 4 years old 16 days after his mother died, a birthday that must have passed in a house still thick with grief. He grew up. He became a man, married a woman named Maud, and raised 4 children of his own, 3 of them named Harry and Clarence and Mildred, and a 4th who carried his father's own name forward into another generation. And he kept moving the way this blood always kept moving, further and further west, Montana, Idaho, and at last Washington State, the far green edge of the continent, about as far west as the road itself goes, before it runs out into the Pacific. Think about what that means for a moment. Ruby was born into a family migration that had begun on the thin, stony farms of New England. Generations before her, she lived one short westward chapter of it and died in the very middle of the map, and her son carried the line clear through to the western edge of the country, where the moving finally had nowhere left to go. The journey her people had been making for 100 years finished itself through her children. She did not get to see a mile of it. Of Alma, the baby daughter, the records say less. She grew up. She carried her mother's blood forward, and the quietness of her record is simply the ordinary quietness of an ordinary life, the kind that history keeps no file on, which is, in its own way, the fate of almost everyone who has ever lived. And Ruby herself stayed where they left her, and then, slowly, stopped being findable at all. Even now, the people who go looking for her, and people do go looking, the family researchers, the devoted readers of the books who trace every branch of this family, can find the town, and find the cemetery, and find nothing to stand beside. The woman is on a page that generations of readers have never stopped opening. The grave is nowhere. That is the full, strange measure of what remembering and forgetting did to Ruby Ingalls. The world can open the book to the exact scene where she is dancing, and cannot walk to the place where she lies. And if you want to feel the full, strange unfairness of that, set Ruby's nowhere beside the rest of her family's somewhere, because the Ingalls are not a lost family. They are, if anything, the most found family in American letters. In the cemetery at De Smet, in South Dakota, the stones stand in a quiet row. Charles, who died in 1902, Caroline, who followed in 1924, Mary, in 1928, and in time the younger sisters too, Carrie and Grace, gathered back to the same ground. Every year, readers by the thousand make the long drive across the plains to that small prairie cemetery, walk the rows, find the names, and stand in silence in front of people they feel they grew up with. And far to the south, in Mansfield, Missouri, Laura herself lies beside Almanzo, and that grave too is a destination. Visited season after season by people who loved her books before they were old enough to read them alone. That is what remembering looks like when it has a place to stand. A stone, a name, a patch of ground where the love of strangers can arrive and set itself down. Nearly everyone in this family has one. And then there is the baby sister, the one in the front row of the photograph, the one in the dancing scene. Ruby has readers too, in her way. Every person who has ever opened Little House in the Big Woods has met her, but her remembering has nowhere to stand. No stone, no certain patch of ground. The most visited family in American children's literature carries, at its far edge, one member no visitor can find, and the longer you sit with that, the more it stops feeling like a simple accident of frontier poverty, and begins to feel like the physical shape of the whole story. The ones who were written were found. The one who was not written was lost. The pen decided, in the end, even the geography of the graves. There is something almost too sad about all of it when you set it beside the dancing scene. Remember her there, in the firelight, in her best dress, named and bright and alive on the page that millions of children have read. And then remember her here, in an unmarked grave on the Nebraska plain that no living person can find. The same woman, the two ends of a single life, made immortal in one place and utterly lost in another. And it raises a question that we cannot fully answer, but that we have to ask because it sits at the very centre of tonight. The family knew where Ruby was buried. Her sister Docia was right there, in the same county. Her brother Charles, up in Dakota, surely received the word that his youngest sister had died. The family knew. They grieved, in whatever private way they grieved. And yet, somehow, across the decades that followed, the exact location of Ruby's grave was allowed to slip away until it was simply gone. How does that happen? How does a family lose one of its own so completely? Part of the answer is just the brutal practicality of frontier life, the poverty and the distance and the perishable wooden markers. But part of the answer, I think, is something harder. Something about how this particular family handled its losses and about the one member of it who held, more than anyone, the power to decide who would be remembered and who would be allowed to fade. Because there was someone in this family who would go on to become the keeper of its entire memory. Someone who would take the Ingalls family and lift it out of obscurity and carry it into the hearts of millions of readers in book after book after book. Someone who chose, with enormous care, which moments to preserve in amber forever and which to leave out. Someone who had stood in that firelit room as a child and watched Aunt Ruby dance, and who, decades later, made the deliberate choice to put that dancing aunt into a book, alive and bright and named, and then to say nothing, ever, about what became of her. That someone, of course, was Laura. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 14 years old when her Aunt Ruby died. She was not a small child anymore, too young to understand. In December of 1881, Laura was a young woman, fresh from surviving the famous hard winter, fully old enough to know exactly what it meant when word came that her father's youngest sister had died down in Nebraska, leaving 2 small children motherless. She understood loss. She had been raised in its shadow her whole life, in a family and on a frontier where death was a constant and familiar visitor. Picture the news arriving, because arrive it did, in whatever form that winter allowed. A letter, most likely, working its way up the lines from Nebraska into Dakota in the December mails, reaching the household in De Smet sometime in the dead of the cold season. We have no record of the moment it was opened, and I will not write the scene for you. No words for Charles that Charles never left us. No tears set down for anyone that no one ever recorded, but hold the plain fact of it because the plain fact is heavy enough on its own. Charles Ingalls, the pa of all the books, a man not yet through his 40s, learning that his baby sister was dead at 26. He had been 19 years old when she was born. She had been the child waving in the dooryard of his whole young manhood, the baby of the house he left behind when he went west to build his own life. And this was not the first such letter of his life, and not the first small grave in his story either. 5 years earlier he had buried a child of his own, a baby son. Hold on to that, boy. We are coming back to him before this chapter is done. And somewhere in that house in De Smet, taking it all in the way a 14-year-old takes in the grief of the grown-ups, sideways, in fragments, through half-open doorways and lowered voices, was Laura, the aunt from the dance at Grandpa's, dead, far away, young, whatever was said in that house in those December days, whatever was felt. Laura carried it. We know she carried it because half a century later she could still reach back across her whole long life and set her Aunt Ruby down on a page dancing, which means the memory never left her. The knowing and the silence lived in her together for 50 years. And then, half a century later, when Laura sat down as an old woman to write the books that would make her family immortal, she made her choices. She reached back into her childhood and she chose what to keep. She kept the big woods and the little house and the long winter. She kept Ma and Pa and her sisters. She kept the fiddle and the fireplace and the sugaring off dance. And into that dance, she placed Aunt Ruby, by name, a pretty young woman in the firelight, preserved forever in the happiest scene she ever wrote. And there she stopped. The marriage, the children, the journey to Nebraska, the death at 26, the grave that vanished into the prairie. None of it ever appears. Laura kept the dancing girl and let the dying woman disappear. Now, I do not believe this was cruelty, and I want to be fair to Laura, because it would be easy and cheap to tell this as a story about a callous niece. And that is not what it was. Consider what Laura was actually doing. She was writing books for children. Gentle books, meant to be read aloud at bedtime, to small children, by their mothers, books about warmth and family and the brave endurance of hard times. The death of a young aunt in an unmarked grave, leaving 2 motherless babies on a lonely frontier, simply has no place in that kind of book. It is not a bedtime story, it is a grief. And Laura, building a warm and gentle world for children, left her griefs outside the door the way she left so many of the family's hardest and darkest truths outside the door. Because the books she was making could not hold them, and if you think I am only guessing about that, if you think the silence around Ruby might be an accident rather than a design, then let me show you the proof. It is the most devastating proof there could be, because it comes from inside the little house itself. A few minutes ago I asked you to hold on to a baby boy. Here he is. In the autumn of 1875, in the middle of the family's hard Minnesota years, Caroline Ingalls gave birth to her 4th child and her first and only son. They named him Charles Frederick, after his father, and they called him Freddie. Laura was 8 years old, and for 9 months she had a little brother. And then, in the high summer of 1876, in the middle of yet another of the family's moves, the baby sickened, declined in a way no one could stop, and died. He was 9 months old, the only son Charles and Caroline Ingalls would ever have. Now, you know the books, or you would not be here tonight. So ask yourself, where is Freddie? He is nowhere. He is not born. He does not laugh from a cradle in the corner of any little house. He does not sicken, and he does not die. The novels step straight across the very years that held him, and the crossing leaves no footprint at all. A reader can travel from the first page of the series to the last, and never once learn that Laura had a brother. And here is the detail that turns that silence from sad into almost unbearable. Laura did write him down, once, in the private memoir she set down first. The plain account of her life meant for adult readers, the one publishers turned away, and the world would not see in her lifetime. There, in a few spare lines, the baby brother lives and dies. She could write it for herself. She could not write it for the world. And when that memoir was broken apart and rebuilt into the gentle novels everyone knows, Freddie was lifted out, and the story closed over the place where he had been, as smooth and seamless as if he had never existed at all, her only brother. So understand what the pattern truly was, because Ruby and Freddie together make it unmistakable. It was not that Laura forgot her dead. It was not that she did not grieve them. It was that the world she built in those books had a law, and the law was this. Hardship may enter, death in the family may not. The books could hold hunger. They could hold blizzards, and grasshoppers, and debt, and fear, and the long grind of starting over. They could even hold Mary's blindness, which is grief of a kind, but grief that stays. Grief that goes on sitting at the family table. What they could not hold was the empty chair. Freddie was real, and Freddie was removed. And once you have seen that, once you know that the books erased the death of Laura's own baby brother, the silence around a far-off aunt in Nebraska stops being a mystery at all. Ruby was not singled out. Ruby simply fell under the same law as everyone this family ever lost. The law of the little house. The dead do not come in, so the silence about Ruby was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of curating. It was the same gentle, deliberate hand that shaped the entire little house world, choosing the bright over the dark, the warm over the cold, the dancing aunt over the dying one. And in doing so, Laura gave the world a beautiful gift, a story of the frontier that has comforted generations. But the gift came at a quiet cost, and the cost was Ruby. The real Ruby, the whole Ruby, the young woman who lived and married and travelled and grieved and died, was traded away so that the dancing aunt could stay frozen forever in the firelight, untouched by what came after. And here is what I think we owe her, and the reason a night like this one is worth spending. Because when we let the books be the only record, Ruby is just a flash of colour at a party, a name in a happy scene, A pretty young woman who exists for a single paragraph and then is gone, but that is not who she was. She was the last child of a vanishing family who grew up watching everyone she loved leave. She was a young woman who crossed the threshold into a marriage and a home of her own. She was a mother of two. She was a sister who loved her sister so much that she packed up her whole life and chased her across half a country to the edge of the map just to be near her again. And she was a woman who died too young at 26 and was laid in a grave the world forgot. That woman deserves to be more than a dancing scene. And tonight, for a little while, she has been. And maybe that is the deepest reason a night like this one is worth spending, beyond the puzzle of the book and the mystery of the grave, because the world is full of rubies. Every family tree is mostly rubies. For every ancestor whose story got written down, there are a dozen who survive now, only as a name and 2 dates. A great aunt, whose ending nobody quite remembers. A young mother in an old photograph, whom no living person can name. They were not lesser lives. Every one of them was a whole world to somebody, to a husband, to children, to a sister, somewhere who loved them across the miles. History simply did not have room, and so it kept the famous brother and let the baby sister go. That is not cruelty. It is only how the light falls, but it means that most of the human past is made of people exactly like Ruby, waiting quietly just outside the lit circle of the famous few. And forgetting, it turns out, is not a permanent condition. That is the small miracle hiding inside tonight, 140-some years after a young woman went into unmarked ground on the Nebraska plains. Her name is being spoken again, slowly, in the dark, in thousands of rooms at once, by people drifting towards sleep with her story in their minds. For the space of one night, the most lost member of America's most found family has been found again. A grave can be lost. A person, it turns out, does not have to be. So let us end where we began. Go back one last time to the firelight at Grandpa's house, deep in the Wisconsin woods. The sap is boiling down to sugar. The fiddle is playing. The furniture is pushed back, and the dancing has begun. And there, by the looking-glass, in her very best dress, is a bright young woman named Ruby, smoothing her skirt, catching her own reflection, with her whole life still ahead of her. Only now you know her. You know where she is going, and how far and for whom. You know about the home she will build, and the children she will bear, and the sister she will follow to the end of the world. You know about the winter of 1881, and the grave on the Nebraska plain that no one can find. You know the whole of her, the dancing girl and the woman she became, held together at last into single thought, the way she always should have been. And one last thread before we let the night close over all of it. There were 2 young aunts getting ready for that dance in Little House in the Big Woods. 2 sisters in their best dresses on the brightest night of the year, and Laura named them both Docia, Ruby, and the years that followed took both of their true stories away from you. One because it was too dark to tell. One because it was too sad to tell. Docia's secret was a courtroom and a prison and a divorce, folded out of sight so carefully that it stayed hidden for a century. Ruby's was simpler and somehow harder. A death with no sentence ever spent on it, and a grave with no stone. The dancing scene was the one window Laura left open on the both of them. A few inches of firelight, through which 2 whole hidden lives can just barely be glimpsed. We have stood at that window twice now, on 2 long nights, and looked through it from both sides. And if you were here for Docia's story, then you know that the dance now holds the 2 of them together one last time. The sister who survived everything, and the sister who did not survive at all. 10 years apart in age, 2 unimaginable roads apart in fate, side by side in the candlelight in their best dresses, and neither of them knowing a single step of what was coming. Laura kept that moment, whatever else she folded away. However much of their truth she carried silently to her own grave, she kept the 2 of them young and bright and dancing, forever in the warmest room she ever built, and perhaps, in the end, that was her way of keeping them. The baby of the family, the aunt in the dancing scene, the one the books forgot, and the one we remembered tonight. Rest easy now. Wherever you are listening from, the fire is low and the night is long, and there is nothing left to do but let it all go quiet. And somewhere far back in the warm heart of an old story, a young woman in her best dress is still dancing in the firelight, and now, at last, someone knows her name. Let her dance, and let yourself gently fall asleep.